Among the many politicians and reformers who influenced the history of Rome, few had the same impact as the Gracchi brothers. Ancient writers praised their numerous qualities centuries after their death, and some of their reforms, although hated during their time, became commonplace a couple of centuries later. Loved by some, hated and vilified by others, their novel ideas and tragic ends continue to inspire passions for these two defenders of the Roman Republic. In this video series, we will explore their short but no less important lives for the history of Rome. But like every good Crusader Kings 2 player knows, the ancestors, the family origins, the early education, and the role models are all important in influencing and shaping people's lives. In this video, we will talk about the historical setting, explore the Gracchi's family history, as well as the brothers' education and their early influences. The following videos will talk about their adult lives, as well as their military and political career. The history of Rome is profoundly rooted in war. War was an integral part of their culture, their history, and their myths. War was even an integral part of its foundation, with the rape of the Sabine women during the 8th century BC. But it wasn't until the middle of the 4th century that Rome entered a period of near constant warfare that lasted around 900 years. We must also mention that in antique Roman society, a respectable Roman only ever did two things: agriculture and politics. Commerce and craftsmanship were frowned upon, and paid work was rare. And even if the Roman farmlands weren't very fertile and their agricultural yield was poor, the Romans were proud of their meager agricultural production nonetheless. The Romans were basically eating rock soup, and they were proud of their rock soup. This is going to be important later. Now, let's concentrate on the 2nd century BC. At this stage, Rome had been in a state of almost constant war for the past 200 years. Each new Roman victory brought them tribute, spoils of war, and new tax revenues. This flow of wealth towards Rome had a large impact on its agrarian society, which led to a deflation of the denarius and a huge economic inflation, whose effects struck the poorer social classes the hardest. On top of the flow of wealth, the military conquest created a flow of new slaves towards Italy. These new slaves were not only used as laborers and farmers, but also as tutors, professors, and child rearers. Their great numbers made them omnipresent in Roman society. The new territorial conquest and the flow of wealth also stimulated commerce and granted Rome many new trade opportunities, allowing them to import many goods and resources like grains and oil. These two resources were being imported in large quantities from fertile, newly conquered lands. Since the lands where those foreign grains and oil were being produced were so much more fertile than the traditional Roman lands, their farmers were then able to sell their larger production for far less comparatively to the Roman farmers. Back then, the Roman army was still an army of conscripted soldiers. Only Roman citizens who owned lands were conscripted into the army. And I'm not talking about the large agricultural plantations that were so widespread during the Roman Empire. I'm talking about small family farms. Because traditionally, Roman men did agriculture to feed their families and could be conscripted to serve in the army. The reason why the Romans only recruited landowners was because back then, people thought that only landowners would really be ready to fight with all their might and until the end, since they had the most to lose. While the poorer Roman citizens, the Capiticenses, which in Latin means those who only have their heads, weren't recruited in the army, because society didn't think they had the same desire to win and defeat the enemies of Rome. And so, Roman farmers were constantly being called to serve in the armies of Rome, sent to fight in wars that were always being fought further and further away. When the wars were being fought around Rome, the men could come back home to plant their fields, fight while the crops were growing, and then come back home to harvest their crops. But when the wars started being waged outside of Italy, the men could be gone for years at a time, away from their wives and families. But the land still had to be cultivated if they wanted their families to eat and if they wanted to be able to pay their taxes. And no matter their efforts, the women had a lot of trouble doing their husbands' jobs around the farm. Now add to that the other problems I mentioned earlier. The Roman lands weren't very fertile, and the local markets were being flooded by foreign imports of cheap grains and oil. So the poor women weren't able to produce enough food to feed their families, cover their expenses, and pay their taxes, which forced them to borrow money from their rich neighbors to survive. But the wars were still dragging on. The men either couldn't come back because they were still needed to fight the wars, or they had died fighting in some foreign lands. And when they were finally able to come back home, a new war would probably be declared not too long after, and there was a chance that they would get conscripted again. So oftentimes, the Roman farmers weren't able to produce enough food to feed their families, pay their taxes, cover their expenses, and pay back the loans they were forced to take. The families were then forced to either sell their family members into slavery to cover their debt, or they'd have to sell their lands, which means they would join the ranks of the Capiticenses. Those farmers saw it as a great injustice for them to be called to fight the enemies of the Republic and serve valiantly for many years, only to come back home and discover that their families were now slaves and that their ancestral homes no longer belonged to them. There were even cases where the man who had been conscripted didn't even have a family. His property was simply unexploited. He didn't have a wife and 5 kids waiting for him at home, who'd be desperate enough to take out some loans and lose the property. But many of these men would come back home after their military service to find that their lands had been incorporated into the plantations of their rich neighbors. They'd leave and fight the enemies of the Republic for years, only to come back home and discover that their own countrymen stole their lands. These rich men obviously had thugs to enforce their authority, and the farmers had no legal recourse to get their lands back when the elite would come and steal their lands. They had a justice system, sure, they could have complained about it to a judge, but the judges were all part of the senatorial class, who were mostly responsible for the land theft. So in either of those two scenarios, the new Capiticensis had no other choice than to find one of the rare paid job offers or to try and beg in the streets of Rome. These events had 2 major negative impacts on Roman society. On top of widening the gap between the rich and the poor among the Roman citizens, it also reduced the recruitment pool for the Roman armies. Because like I mentioned earlier, the Romans only recruit citizens who own land. Farmlands were slowly being taken over by the richer social classes, who were adding them to their growing plantations. Meanwhile, the numbers of Capiticensis kept on growing. So the Roman army would obviously run into some recruitment problems at some point. Even if the senatorial class was proportionally more active in the military, they were usually kept in the back, while the peasants were used as cannon fodder on the front lines. So the senatorial class couldn't be expected to cover for the recruitment shortages. This recruitment shortage would obviously be a big problem for an aggressive and imperialist state like Rome, who was always looking to annex and conquer the neighboring states. After all, fortune and political power were built on military victories, and Roman politicians were extremely ambitious. It was obvious to anyone paying attention that sooner or later, a problem would arise if something wasn't done. And if that wasn't enough of a problem for the Romans, the peasants were growing more and more opposed to the draft. They knew that being called to serve in the army possibly meant their family's ruin. Some people saw the problem coming and tried to correct the situation. The most famous among them were the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchis, who would dedicate their short political careers to fixing the recruitment problems and restoring the middle-class farmers. Now that we've established the historical setting, let's look into their origins and their family history. The Gracchi brothers came from 2 distinguished families. For starters, their mother Cornelia was born to the Scipio family, one of the most important, if not the most important patrician family of the era. Her father was Publius Cornelius Scipio, nicknamed the Scipio Africanus, following his victory over Hannibal Barca and the Carthaginians during the Second Punic War. Scipio Africanus amassed a massive fortune during his consulship when he led the armies of Rome in the Second Punic War, and when he served as a legate under his brother Lucius in Greece. During his time, 2 different cultural factions were clashing in Roman society. There were the Philhellenes, who loved and admired Greek culture, and there were the anti-Greek Roman conservatives, who saw the Greeks and their culture as foreign invaders who had no rights to be in Italy. Scipio Africanus was a huge Philhellene. He took many Greek intellectuals under his protection and patroned many art pieces and literary works. Cornelia probably spent her youth in her father's villa in Liternum, where she would have received a typical Greek education. She more than likely studied, or at least been exposed to Greek literature, poetry, history, rhetoric, and Stoic philosophy. Her excellent education provided her the skills and mindset to stand out among her peers, helping her become almost as iconic as her father and sons. Many stories circulated about her life and her high moral character. It's often hard to differentiate between what really happened and the urban legends. So I'll share with you guys the stories, and I'll just tell you guys what is or isn't credible. Like many women in her time period, she was, in my opinion, married off to forge a political alliance. Her father was an extremely important man in Roman politics. It obviously goes without saying that he had his share of political rivals and enemies. One of those rivals was Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, another great political figure of the era. Plutarch tells us that at some point, Scipio Africanus' brother Lucius was going to be sent to jail for something. So apparently Tiberius, while holding the office of tribune of the plebe, spontaneously decided to hold a speech on the Capitol during a holiday where all the VIPs and the political elite were reunited to share a feast dedicated to the god Jupiter. Although Tiberius was a sworn political enemy of the Scipios, he came to the defense of Africanus' brother Lucius. Plutarch wrote that Tiberius made a spectacle, He claimed that he wouldn't suffer to see Lucius be sent to the same jail where his brother Africanus imprisoned so many enemies of the Republic, and ultimately used his vetoing power to stop Lucius from being imprisoned. The senators were apparently so impressed and moved by Tiberius' defense of the Scipios that they clamored that he and Africanus embraced and made peace. They even insisted and pushed for the new political alliance to be sealed with a wedding, demanding Africanus betroth his daughter Cornelia to Tiberius before the end of the feast. After the feast was over, Livy wrote that Africanus went back home to share the news with his wife Aemilia. Upon hearing he'd just betrothed their daughter, she became furious. He hadn't even had time to tell her who the groom was that she flew into a rage, stating that he had no right to marry off their daughter like that, claiming that as a mother, she should have been consulted about her daughter's future, even if the groom was someone like Tiberius Sempronius Gracchis. Happy with the coincidence, Africanus told Aemilia the groom he found for their daughter Cornelia was in fact Tiberius Sempronius Gracchis. Upon hearing the news, Livy says the domestic harmony was immediately restored in the household. Some modern historians like Suzanne Dixon doubt the authenticity of the story. They find it too theatrical and believe the story was embellished. Even if I personally doubt the part where the fight between Aemilia and her husband ceased the moment she learned who the groom was, I think the part of the story during the feast was probably 100% true. Italians are known to be theatrical when it comes to expressing their emotions in public, and is there a better time to make peace with your rival and to sign a new political alliance than during a great religious feast where all the political elite is gathered? If I wanted to pull a big political show, I don't think I'd be able to find a better occasion. Now let's get back to the betrothal. We know that by the time of the wedding, Africanus was pretty old, while in contrast his daughter Cornelia was quite young. Some modern historians estimate that Cornelia was in her early to mid-teens when she was betrothed to Tiberius. We're not sure if Africanus died before or after Cornelia's wedding, because ancient sources keep contradicting each other. To give you guys a few examples, the ancient writer Polybius wrote that Africanus was already dead when his daughter was betrothed to Tiberius, and that it was Lucius himself who betrothed Cornelia to Tiberius during the feast. Even the ancient writer Livy had no idea what truly happened. The different accounts and anecdotes are so contradicting that simply put, no one knows what really happened. What we do know is that Tiberius was tribune of the plebe in 187 BC, and Suzanne Dixon thinks the wedding took place in 183 BC, which seems to indicate that Cornelia was too young to marry Tiberius when they were first betrothed, and that they had to wait 4 years before actually getting married. We also know that by the time of their betrothal, Tiberius had already started his political career, underlining the big age difference between the two. But no matter what we might think, their marriage didn't seem to be miserable or broken. The both of them were big fans of Greek culture and supporters of the Philhellene movement, as evident by Cicero's writings. Cicero, who himself lived 200 years after Tiberius, wrote that Tiberius was known as a talented orator, who was renowned for one of his public speeches where he eloquently addressed the Rhodian diplomats in perfect Greek, which shows us that Tiberius studied the Greek language and the rhetorical arts, two things the Romans learned from the Greeks, showing us that both husband and wife were big fans of Greek culture. On top of being a big Philhellene, Tiberius was an important political personality of his time, even if his sons and father-in-law seem to have eclipsed him in our historical records. Like I mentioned earlier in his engagement story, we know that he held the office of tribune of the plebs, but he was also given consulship on 2 different occasions. And for those who might not know, the consulship was located at the top of the Roman political hierarchy. Think of it as a ladder, and every step is a different government office. The top one just before the Senate was that of the consulship. To simply explain the job of a consul, they had supreme civil and military powers. The supreme civil power meant that they could write and propose laws, call upon the citizens to vote on proposed laws, organize elections to choose the new magistrates, and cancel the decision made by any other magistrate except for those taken by the tribune of the plebs or the Senate. So yes, a consul could veto any decision taken by another consul. As for their supreme military power, the consuls weren't allowed to declare wars. Only the Senate had the power to do so. But once the war had been declared, their supreme military powers allowed the consuls to recruit and mobilize troops, as well as choosing who would act as their legates. On top of that, the consul was also tasked with establishing the different campaign objectives with the Senate, as well as deciding with them the resources and manpower required for the upcoming campaign. The consul even had the power of life and death over his men, which included the power of decimation, a collective punishment used to punish a large group of people guilty of a capital offense by forcing them to beat to death 1/10 of their group, chosen at random. The office of consul, as well as the powers it entailed, were reserved to a small group of citizens. Even among the senatorial class, few Romans would ever be lucky enough to hold that power. So it's pretty impressive that Tiberius had been elected for consulship twice, and each of his consulships were awarded with a triumph. The military triumph was a parade in honor of the consul, and the army led to victory. To be awarded a triumph by the Senate, he had to have accomplished certain feats that were considered heroic, like vanquishing a terrible enemy, winning a great victory, or bringing back a huge amount of loot. Consuls who had been awarded with a triumph were few and far in between, and Tiberius had been rewarded with 2 different triumphs, proving without a doubt that Cornelia wasn't married to a loser. I would also like to add that Tiberius had such a brilliant political and military career that I'm convinced it was at least partially due to the Scipio's support when he ran for the different offices that he held. It's for this reason that I believe Plutarch's story where Tiberius defended Lucius Scipio during the Feast of Jupiter. But I don't believe the defense of Lucius was as spontaneous as Plutarch claimed it was. I instead believe that Tiberius planned to defend the Scipios to earn their future political support. After all, the Scipios were one of the, if not the most important families in Rome at the time, so gaining their support would surely help him have a great political career. And that's exactly what Tiberius had with his 2 consulships and his 2 military triumphs. In my mind, his great political career reinforces the idea that his defense of Lucius had been a calculated political move. Like the saying goes, if you can't beat him, join him. Now let's move on to the Gracchis' family life. Like I mentioned earlier, Cornelia and Tiberius were both Philhellenes. Their villa must have been rich with Greek culture, and Suzanne Dixon believes that Cornelia would have continued to educate herself after her wedding with Tiberius. Ancient sources say Cornelia had 12 children in about 13 years. Modern historians don't exactly know if her children died of different illnesses during their childhood, or if ancient writers also counted stillborns. Among the 3 children that we know of, we have Sempronia, the firstborn and only daughter, followed by the middle child, her eldest son, who was named Tiberius in his father's honor, and finally the youngest son, Gaius, born 9 years after his brother Tiberius Jr. They were the only ones out of the 12 to reach adulthood. Even if we don't know the names of the other children, ancient historians took the time to underline just how much Cornelia was a devoted mother to her children, and how they would always come first in her life. The family lived in Tiberius's mansion in Misenum, close to the Pyre, which saw lots of traffic coming from Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. Places where Cornelia's father Africanus and her husband Tiberius had established good connections. Cicero tells us that Cornelia was heavily involved in her children's education and made sure they received the best education possible. Her eldest son, Tiberius Jr., counted among his teachers the Stoic philosopher Blosius of Cumae, and Diophanes of Mytilene, who was, according to Cicero, the most eloquent speaker and rhetorician of all of Greece, taught the rhetorical arts to both of her sons. They also say Cornelia would limit the time her sons spent studying philosophy, to make them focus on studying the rhetorical arts instead. Suzanne Dixon claims Cornelia would have chosen Blosius and Diophanes herself, to make sure her boys would receive the same education that she herself received as a little girl. It's obvious for us the teachers and models our children receive will have a great impact on our kids' development and what kind of people they will grow up to be. But in Cornelia's time, the Romans didn't know that. They'd give their kids to slaves, who barely spoke Latin, without ever wondering if they had the qualifications and skills to properly raise and educate a child. Cornelia was therefore an innovator when it came to child rearing, and made sure her sons would receive all the necessary skills, qualities, and knowledge to become great men. Cornelia was such a devoted mother and wife that she went down in history as the archetype for the perfect wife and mother. The Roman world admired her so much that they had a ton of stories showcasing her numerous virtues. One of those stories was passed down to us by Valerius Maximus, and tells us that a certain companion woman had some of the most beautiful jewels in the world. The companion woman was so proud that she'd show them off to everyone she met. One day, she went to pay a visit to Cornelia while her boys were at school. She was so proud of her jewels that she couldn't help herself and started bragging about them to Cornelia. Cornelia made sure to drag the conversation as long as possible, until her sons came back from school. Then, she introduced them to her guests by saying, "Here are my jewels." Now I gotta be honest about that story. Many modern historians doubt the story actually happened, because Plutarch wrote a similar story about a Spartan woman, but I don't agree with them. The Spartan woman Plutarch wrote about was talking about duty and work, not wealth. We must also remember that Cornelia received a Greek education, so she must have surely been taught some Greek stories in her childhood. And one of those stories could have very well been the story of the Spartan woman that Plutarch wrote about. And in Valerius' story, Cornelia made a conscious effort to keep the focus of the conversation on the companion's jewels until her sons came back. So it's possible she knew the story of the Spartan woman from her youth and had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to brag about her kids without looking too pretentious. After all, we all had at least that one line we kept in our head, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity to use it. Now let's get back to Cornelia. Like I've mentioned earlier, Cornelia's numerous qualities and the devoted attention she gave her children all must have pleased her husband Tiberius tremendously. Even if they had their little problems here and there like every other couple, like when Tiberius took one of their female slaves as a mistress, ancient sources say that Tiberius loved his wife tremendously. Plutarch wrote down a story about it that he apparently learned from Gaius Gracchis, Tiberius' youngest son, who himself apparently learned it from his mother Cornelia. Plutarch wrote that one day Tiberius found 2 snakes in their marital bed, one male and one female. He took the snakes to Naruspex, a sort of diviner if you will, to ask him what it could possibly mean. Naruspex explained to Tiberius that he couldn't release or kill the 2 of them, and explained to him that the snakes represented his marriage. He continued his explanation, and told Tiberius that the female snake contained his wife's essence, while the male snake contained his own essence, and whichever died first would indicate who between him and his wife Cornelia would die first. So Tiberius, who loved his wife dearly, started thinking. He took into consideration his old age, how his wife was still in her youth, and finally decided to kill the male snake and release the female snake. Plutarch wrote that Tiberius died not long after, leaving behind his young wife and their 12 children. Think about what he did. How many men do you think would have taken the same decision? Now, how many men with mistresses do you think would have agreed to die to spare their wives? I'm sure a lot of men would have killed the female snake without thinking twice, but Tiberius agreed to end his own life to prolong the life of his dear wife. So she really must have been special for him to have taken that decision. And what about Tiberius' mistress? Do you guys want to know what happened to her? Back then, slaves barely had any rights, and Cornelia could have basically done anything she wanted to her. I've heard horror stories of masters forcing their slaves to cook and eat their own legs, or of slaves being pushed in a pool full of lampreys. But do you guys know what Cornelia did to the slave girl? She freed her and married her to another former slave. And it wasn't the only time Cornelia showed herself to be magnanimous. She showed so many qualities that all the ancient writers agreed that Tiberius took the right decision. After Tiberius' death, Cornelia became the only one responsible for her children's upbringing. To give you guys an idea of how old the kids were, Gaius, the youngest son, was still just a baby, and some people think he wasn't even born yet. But like I mentioned earlier, instead of letting slaves raise her children, Cornelia made sure to find the best possible teachers to educate them, making sure they focused their time on studying and practicing their rhetorical skills. Cornelia never remarried, choosing instead to focus her time and energy on educating her children, but not because she never had any suitors. Because believe it or not, she was asked in marriage by Ptolemy VIII, the goddamn pharaoh of Egypt. Can you guys believe it? One of the Ptolemies wanted to marry our Cornelia. It's every woman's dream to marry a king and become queen. Any woman would have literally jumped on the occasion and screamed yes at the top of her lungs. But not Cornelia. She refused to marry a pharaoh because she wanted to concentrate on her children's education and wanted to raise them to be good Romans. Now that we know this about her, we understand why the Romans had such a high opinion and admiration for her. And besides, she had no reason to envy the jewels of the crown of Egypt. After all, she already had her own jewels waiting for her at home. And here's where we will end the story for now. At first I was going to jump straight into the life of the Gracchi brothers, but while researching their childhood, I discovered that their family was way too interesting to just gloss over, and I decided to take the time to talk about their family history. I hope you guys found the topic as interesting as I did, and if you did, don't forget to leave a like on the video. Leave a comment if you have anything to add to the topic, or if you want to tell me what you thought of the video. In the next video, we'll start talking about Tiberius' short life and political career. But first, I need to fix my audio recording problems, because right now I spend like 80% of my time trying to clean up the audio. That will hopefully increase my production speed. So I wish you guys a happy holiday season, and a happy new year, and I'll see you guys next year.